Okay, I guess we'll sort of get started. Looks like most folks are here. Um, when I sort of finished off last time, um, where I was sort of at was that it's, in my view, the easiest way to talk about Hawaiian culture, Hawaiian society at the time of European contact, or basically figure 1778, is you have to understand, this is what I mentioned last time, and you're going to get really tired of hearing it. But in my view, and this is pretty standard, it's not too exotic, it's important to remember that Hawaiian society was not a stable, static society that the Europeans come in and sort of like shatter and change. Hawaiian society was going through enormous amounts of change socially, politically especially, but also in terms of land and person relationships in very, very complex ways. And the best way to do is just read Kamakawa's Ruling Chiefs. And of course, you have to remember, he's a part of that, in the sense that he's the generation after those ruling chiefs that's among the first students in Lahaina Luna writing. So he's writing about stuff he either experienced or he heard it from his like parents and other relatives. So it's not, he's not some 20th, 21st century academic looking back at the past. He's actually, to a certain extent, a limited player in all this. The writings of John Papa'i are probably the most fascinating because he actually was a player. It's really hard even today to figure out just exactly who he was and what he was up to. But he was there's 3 or 4 different terms for it, but he was basically when we get into Filipino society, he'd be the compadre. He'd be the blood companion of the Kamehamehas. So he was intimately involved in the political system. He was intimately involved in the stability of the monarchy. No one really knows just exactly how much his fingers into what was going on in the early monarchy period. But everyone that interacted with the monarchy knew right off the bat you PR'd the king and you PR'd him. If you needed something from the queen, you PR'd John Papa'i first. So he was like the go-to guy. So his writings about the pre-monarchy period are absolutely fascinating because it's from a guy who's a player in this same system. So we're really unique because in the rest of the Pacific, you don't see this. I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to put a context for all this. The Europeans show up 1778. To all intents and purposes, it's actually easier to think of the Europeans showing up around 1790. Sure, you have Cook's arrival, but he's only here for a couple of weeks. He only, his time on the Big Island is only, I think, about 1.5 weeks total. He almost spends as much time at Waimea over in Kauai. Doesn't interact with the other islands. So the interaction, though, it's decisive in terms of sort of crystallizing aspects of Hawaiian culture and politics that were changing. Really wasn't an enormous shock. It's in the 1790s. Vancouver comes over, the next of the big British explorers, La Perouse. And what you get, more important, is you start to get a group of European Americans, largely Brits and Americans, and then later Australians, who come and actually move to Hawaii and settle in Hawaii. This group never gets a lot of creds, and I don't understand why. It's like everyone forgets about them. I think because the missionaries are such an easy bullseye. But the missionaries don't arrive till 1821, and a lot of the changes, in fact, the vast majority of changes that have occurred have happened before that. You have to remember that when the missionaries arrive, Kamehameha is dead. And the big revolt against his family's rule has already happened on the Big Island. So an enormous amount of change in Hawaiian society happens before the missionaries are here. And one thing that aggravates the crap out of me and a lot of us is you'll frequently get this sloppy thing that, well, the missionaries are responsible for everything. Dude, they weren't even the first ones around. They were like 40 years late to the game. So when you're looking at change in Hawaiian society, the huge finger that should be pointed is to these group of Americans, Brits, and Australians who move to Hawaii, set up shop, become sort of embedded in the system. Some cases, like Young, they actually become high chiefs in the family, become power brokers. In other cases, they're just sort of around. You get guys like Paula Marin, who had property in basically what's now Chinatown, who's one of these other really sort of ambiguous characters, who's responsible for a lot of the different plants, especially the invasive ones, and a lot of the different animals that cause so much trouble. He imports them from Mexico. So these guys have all sorts of different impacts, but it has nothing to do with the 1821 group from Boston. It's this period between 1790 and 1820. Enormous amounts of change are happening because you've got a group that's here in Hawaii that's trying to make money, because that's the reason all these folks were here. The only stuff I've ever seen that actually talks about them is the various stories in Thrum, where he's talking about Honolulu in the 1820s and these guys pissing each other off and getting into fistfights in the street and suing each other and all the different nonsense these guys were up to. They were a much bigger force in the early monarchy period than the missionaries who show up later. So what you have is there's all this sort of disturbance going on for maybe 30 or 40 years. The missionaries show up. Their agenda is entirely different. They want to, and you have to remember, as we'll get into it, one of the main reasons the missionaries arrive here is to save the Hawaiians, who they saw as these, innocent, childlike, children of God, lost tribe of Israel package. They wanted to save them from the Euro-Americans who were basically taking money and screwing the Hawaiians over. So the missionaries came over here. One of their main agendas was to protect the Hawaiians from the bad folks from their own group. So they had this very complex agenda. One of the ways they do that is by becoming teachers and converting, or I should say, adapting Hawaiian to a written form. One of the ways they very cleverly realized to do that is rather than to teach children how to read and write, is what you teach as adults how to read and write. And it's really important to understand that when they set up Lahaina Luna, which is the first educational institution here in Hawaii, it's set up specifically and only chiefs are allowed into it. And Lahaina Luna was not a public school. It was a school of the Ari'i. And not surprisingly, the chiefs being very, very clever, especially the Kamehameha group, they very quickly made sure that only folks that were part of their entourage were allowed into that school because they realized the huge strategic implications of being able to read and write. So the school becomes an institution tied to the monarchy for very explicit political purposes, because you have to remember that, and we'll see as we get through this, the Kamehamehas did not have a lot of support on the other islands. The Kamehameha monarchy, right down to the Kamehameha IV, was seen as an imposition from the folks on Oahu and Kauai especially. Kauai basically never bought into the Kamehameha monarchy in some ways. So when you think of the Hawaiian Islands and a monarchy, it's not a nice, clean, tidy package. It's a very complex, multi-layered, oftentimes, almost stab in the back situation. So the school starts up, and rather cleverly, Andrews, who's the guy that teaches in the school, does the reading and writing in the school. He grabs some of these chiefs, and as part of their practice assignments, he tells them what he wants them to do is write about Hawaiian culture. So what you get is this whole series of very sophisticated, very complicated writings by Hawaiians who are part of the elite about the society, one that they're a part of, and about the way that the society was prior to all these changes occurring in the 1820s. Now that's unique because nowhere else in the Pacific do you see this. The British missionaries are in Tahiti by I think about 1802 or something like that. But they never get the support from the Tahitian chiefs. Among other things, you don't have a Tahitian leader who's actually controlling the system. So you never get the Tahitians in charge thinking of the process of learning how to read and write as being something that has political implications and power implications. So we don't have writings by early Tahitians about Tahitian society. There's nothing in Samoa, Tonga, or the rest of Polynesia that deals with, so even the Maori, who get into this fairly early, sort of have the same situation. They do not have a body of literature that was generated by Maori in the early period when change was still something new. So this puts Hawaii in a very, very unique situation that would have a huge amount of writing from Hawaiian intellectual elites right at the start of the enormous amounts of change of the arrival of the missionaries. But it's important to remember that these guys are also writing after this 40-year period of change has occurred. So when you read Kamakau or E. or Malo or the rest of these guys, and you see this a lot in Malo's writings, also Kepolino's, you find a lot of their writings frequently refer to the way things were when I was a kid and the way things were now. So they're very clear about these ideas of change. So in that context, what we're going to look at is always part of this very complex pattern of change that was occurring, and largely taken from what we know from the writings of these guys in the early part of the 19th century. So Last time I think I sort of ended up with this pa'au. And this is that audio that I mentioned. Again, it's a fascinating example. I'm sure there were others. Probably at least in Melanesian, there must have been a bunch. But this is the only one that we actually have really good historical documentation for in terms of a religion that starts up brand new in Polynesia, post-dating all the sort of traditional systems, that's designed to basically, in a very explicit way, change the society. So the audio is a fascinating thing that really doesn't get the focus that it deserves. And again, I'm not particularly sure. I think in part because Western academics are still fascinated with where did Polynesians come from. And I think in a lot of cases there's still a really sloppy sort of thing that says, the system that Cook saw when he arrived here is what people always had. The system that the Brits and the French saw when they arrived in Tahiti was the system they always had. So there really isn't, in some ways, not a lot of very good history in a lot of the Polynesian literature. Sad to say. Hopefully that'll change soon. Anyways, so when we're looking at Hawaiian society specifically, we want to look at the fact that there's a system that you might call the sort of pan-Polynesian system. That's what Hawaii had till around 1550. Then this new proselytizing religion, so it'd be like Southern Baptist or the Latter-day Saints or Jehovah's Witnesses, a whole new group comes in and they're very aggressively saying, what you guys are doing is not right. What you guys are doing is not what the gods intended. Here, we're going to give you the new way of doing things, and this is the way you guys should do it because this is the right way the real people do it. And I've been told by the God, this is how we're going to do it. Now, as I mentioned, we don't really know, and in fact, I remember there's some short articles by Ganoje, I can't find them, that actually talk about sort of trying to figure out how a religion that starts up on a really small island in the eastern part of the Marquesas would become so aggressively successful in the rest of Polynesia. Because when I get into this, it's really hard to figure out why Polynesians would give up what they've got for what this new religion promises. Usually since religions are belief-based and belief is something that's carried in the head, religions are incredibly durable. You can sit there and you can genocide people, you can do everything you can to get rid of a religion, but they're incredibly hard to get rid of because if people still believe in it, they'll still practice it, even if they have to do it to hiding. Early Christianity in the Roman Empire being an example. And so why people giving up a religion is usually a result of an enormous amount of self-doubt. People find themselves in a world where the religion they have and the religion they've embraced doesn't seem to make sense or doesn't seem to answer the needs they have in the world they're in. Something we go through in the intro anthro class. And so in that situation, then they're liable to drop a religion and switch to a religion. But you can sit there and you can do a contest. The Mongols were famous for this. They had an entertainment in the Mongolian Empire was to bring in missionaries from different groups and have them, try to preach. They actually did a contest, almost like, like Dancing of the Stars or something. They do a contest and the Mongols would sit there and the guys that won, they'd keep alive and the other guys they just killed. So I'm suspecting, being a missionary in the Mongol Empire was sort of risky. But this whole idea that they could do this stuff and see it as entertainment, it didn't change their religion, is very much related to the durability of religion. So one of the huge puzzles is why Polynesian society, which seemed very durable in large part actually still is, would suddenly jump into a new religion that basically delegitimizes a large part of the traditional system. It's a huge question, which basically no one's looking at least in the English literature. I suspect maybe one or two of the French guys are, but I haven't seen anything in print. I haven't talked to these guys in ages, so I don't know what they're up to personally. So anyway, so let's look at the old system, the system before here in Hawaii, this Pa'au group shows up on the Big Island. So Polynesian society, I think I sort of finished off with this. Polynesian society is based on the large extended family. And this is the concept of clan, which I went through that last time, right? In this class? Anyone, someone? Clan versus lineage?
I don't think we did that.
I don't think.
Oh, okay. Sorry. You and the GR 204 class are doing stuff at the same time, so I'm losing track. Not that that's unusual with me. Okay, let's do those first. If you're tracing your relatives, there's basically two ways you do it. And this is one of those areas that you have to remember, modern American society is really weird. In fact, if you're an anthropologist and you're talking about societies, you could frequently use American society as one of the strangest. Because many of us grow up in that society, we see it as norm. But that's not true of most of the world's populations. In most of the world's view of the world, American society is considered very fringe. The values and attitudes we have are really, really strange. And one of the key ones would be taken largely from the British system in the United States. And I think this is largely due to the fact that a huge part of the population is migrants, is that lineage becomes the really key way that people identify family. Now, lineage would be very simply, if Sarah, for example, says she's related to, who's that guy that died? Oh, Howard Hughes, that guy that died 1,000,000 years ago, was really weird, that had a ton of money. If she says that she's actually his granddaughter, so she contacts the Hughes Foundation and says, I need to have my bills at Chaminade paid. And I think, you guys should give me a couple $1 million to help me through my life. I should have, because I'm Howard Hughes' granddaughter, and he was worth a ton of money. What are the lawyers going to ask her? Or what are the lawyers going to tell her? What are they going to want to see?
Prove it.
Prove it, yeah. They're going to say, dude, what the hell? Anyone could say they're so-and-so's granddaughter. In fact, I think when he died, a bunch of folks said they were. First thing they're going to say, now, how is she going to prove it? What would she have to have? First off, she has to have one thing, a piece of paper.
Birth certificate.
Yeah, she has to have a birth certificate. Now, if she's going to tie herself to Howard Hughes, what does she also got to have?
Like some sort of family tree or something.
Yeah, and it's got to be, again, a bunch of birth certificates tied in there where she can actually prove it on paper. This is the concept of lineage. In fact, you hit it exactly right. The word family tree, or I should say the concept of family tree. You have all these people in it. You can prove the link. So-and-so was born, and here was their husband or wife, and then here are their kids, and so-and-so passed away on this day, and then all this stuff up there. And it's all on paper. That's the concept of lineage. The British are into this. They move it over to the American colonies. It becomes part and parcel of the American legal system. And it's the way that Americans see things. Americans see things basically as pieces of paper that you bring up into court or something like that to prove relationships. Now, the weird part about that is if you don't have that proof, Americans tend to be really leery of the idea you're related to someone if you can't, quote, prove it, unquote. So proof in the American or the Anglo-American system is this word lineage. Okay. Now, you guys also see this because when the United States becomes the dominant force in North America and, of course, later takes over Hawaii, this becomes the attitude that if you want to get into Kamehameha schools, you have to prove your lineage. If you want to get into CAM, you have to show a piece of paper which shows that you got partial Hawaiian heritage, and it has to be pieces of paper. It has to be something you can, quote, prove, unquote. In my case, my family's part Arapaho, and that's based on pieces of paper. My niece, for example, is over half Fox Shawnee, and that's on pieces of paper. So in that situation, you've got pieces of paper that prove who you are. And if you don't have them, everyone's going to go, yeah, okay, that's a nice story, but and you ain't going to get into CAM, and you ain't going to get this, and you ain't going to get that. Now, that's not the way that most people in most of the world see relationships and family. In most of the world, relationships and family are based on the term that's used in anthropology. It's called clan. Now, clans are a very different concept, and they oftentimes overlay. But if you have a family that sees themselves as the relationships being clan-based, and there's the concept of lineage, clan's always going to be seen as more compelling than lineage. So if you would, lineage is like a poor second cousin version of a clan in the relationships. Clan initially looks the same. So in a clan system, you have the people who are you by virtue of birth or marriage that you're related to. What's added into this is the concept of time. We'll say that Angelica says that she's related to George Washington. What would be the problem with that? I'll give you a hint. Where do you get a birth certificate from?
Courthouse.
Generally a hospital or someplace like that. A nurse, someone fills it out, and I've got one that says I'm from da 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 da. Okay. Did you have hospitals in 1750? No. They didn't have birth certificates back then. They would put them in Bibles and stuff. But the problem she's going to have is if she says she's actually related to George Washington, is you're not going to have a paper trail back that far. Now, if she says even more so she's related to, I don't know why she would, she says she's related to William the Conqueror, who took over England back in, I don't know, 1,000 years ago or something like that. There's going to be absolutely no paper trail at all. So on one hand, she doesn't have to prove it because there's no paper trail. On the other hand, she can't prove it to convince someone because there's no paper trail. So lineages are sort of weird because they're sort of dependent on, if you want to, legal documents. So they're not very good going through time. They can only go so far and then pop because, birth certificates only have existed since roughly the 1870s. Prior to that, you have family Bibles, which might go back to the 1600s, but most families don't have those back to say 1800. So even in England and the United States, where this is so important, people really couldn't prove their lineage back very far. In a clan system, clans go back in time interminably. And this is one of the main differences. In a clan system, you see yourselves going up a family tree. You see yourselves going back in a genealogy, but it goes back in time till it'd be sort of, if you think of American English, it'd be like once upon a time. So it goes back in a time before there was writing, back in a time before there were pieces of paper, back in a time when all you have is oral tradition. And in this concept, that's where clans are based. Clans aren't based in the present. Clans are based in the past. Now, the other part of clans that are really, really central is that clans are based in a principle that at some point or time, the group of people that see themselves as part of that particular clan are actually the result of a particular thing that back once upon a time got lonely and decided to make children. So it made like miniature versions of itself. And that's the concept of a clan ancestor. And this is the key principle of clans, regardless of whether it's a Chinese clan, like the Zhongs in central China, and how many hundreds of millions of people there are that are that. If it's the Kihavahini in Kaneohe, if it's my particular clan, the Arapaho clan, and we're the Snake clan, it's all the same thing. It doesn't matter what society is. The principle is exactly the same. The living members of the group are actually attached to each other by virtue of something that happened a long time ago, or if you would, before time. Now, that sort of has two parts to it. One is everyone within the clan then is actually a result of a conscious effort by a thing to make them. So if I'm the descendant in a clan, I have an ancestor that intentionally made the family. So our link and our loyalty is to that thing because they made us. So among other things, you're not going to have the idea of a creation time and a divinity or a God that's going to make everyone. This is a real important concept to understand, especially in modern contemporary Pacific Island societies, because all Pacific Island societies were clan-based. And you still see this a lot in the fact that in Pacific Island societies, there's a very strong sense of the power of the family, which is sort of a modern version of the clan. But that's also very much a closed shop. When you think about it, if Kobe's descended from Pele here, so he's descended from one of the goddesses who was in charge of fire and heat, and Julian's descended from Kamapuaa, who's the pig god who's in charge of water, fertility, and such like that. And so everyone that Julian's related to is going to be part of that same clan, and they're all descended and we're all made, if you want to, by Kamapuaa. And in the same way, all of Kobe's relatives were made and set up by Pele. In that situation, if the two of them bump into each other, what don't they see? Or let me rephrase this, what do they have in common? Do they see themselves as all being human beings? You guys are different species. I mean, if you want to use a modern Western word, you're part of entirely separate groups. Yeah, you might look like each other. You might talk, you might even speak the same language, but you're not going to see yourself as the same thing. If you don't have a sense of a common Judeo-Christian Islamic concept of a common species put by a particular thing that spreads across the world, so all people are the same. Remember the bias I was talking about before? If you don't have that, then folks like Kobe, who might be from, say, Puna over in the Big Island, are not going to be particularly interested in going to Kahana on Oahu, because the people, the things that are there aren't really people. In a clan system, the concept of people sort of starts at the folks that were built like you. So if you would, their version of sociobiology is sort of clan-based. Now, you still see this a lot. There's a tremendous amount of conflict in most Polynesian societies between families in the same society. You don't get into it with strangers, you get into it with other families, and it makes sense if you realize that in the traditional concept, those families actually weren't the same as you. Okay, so clan is a very different concept than lineage. The second part of that, and the reason that people would embrace it so strongly, is a common held principle that you see in all these societies, is that the clan ancestor did not exist in a point in time and then die or pass out. The ancestor is still seen as being around. If you go back to our part of Western Kansas and stuff like that, there's all sorts of Arapaho stories about particular places, and the ancestor still exists there. And so if you were to go there and you're part of that particular clan, you can sit down and this very strange looking guy who's about 6-something feet tall and he's covered in scales will come and talk to you, and that's actually the ancestor. So the ancestor never died. The ancestor that made us is actually still around. So these things exist out of time. Now that means that you're going to behave, because the last thing you want to do is piss off something that exists out of time. If you want to, they're essentially immortal. And pissing off immortals, even outside of most of those, Marvel movies, is considered, on the short list of incredibly bad ideas. So in a Hawaiian context, which is typical of this, I forget which one it is. If you're Julian and your Kamapuaa is your ancestor, hang on a second, let me close the door. Got traffic. So if he's hanging out in Kahana, which is one of Kamapuaa's stomping grounds, Kahana made, Kamapuaa made that valley. So the stories are very clear. Kamapuaa was rolling around there, rolled around that, and made the shape of the valley. So the land that Julian is farming was put there by his ancestor. The water that he drinks was put there by his ancestor. The food that he eats was basically given to him by his ancestor. Sure, he has to grow it, but the ability to grow it in a particular location was there by the ancestor. Now, on top of that, since the ancestor's still around and the ancestor's watching to see what its great-great-great-great-grandkids are up to, he's going to be under an enormous amount of, not really maybe pressure, but he's under an enormous amount of examination to make sure he does things the way the ancestor said you should do them. Okay. We'll say that for, if you want to put it in a modern context, we'll say that Josephine is living in her great-grandma's house in Palolo. So her grandma still owns the house. So Josephine's living in it because she's going to Chaminade so she can hang out there. In that situation, is she probably going to do a lot of remodeling because she wants the house to look more cute for herself? No, it's not her house. It's her great-grandma's house. She's just living in it. She's like you guys renting or living in a dorm. She sees herself very much as a temporary. There's absolutely no doubt in her mind that house, that structure is not hers. It's that really old lady's. In the same way, if you're living in Kahana and you're Kamapuaa's children, it's his valley. He made it. He's still there. And if you talk to two of the families that live back there, they'll talk about it. Almost all of them will give you stories. You're never sure how much these are actually stories they buy into 100%, and especially in, say 2020, how much these are stories that are good to tell people to see if you can get them a little bit rattled. But there's a ton of stories, especially when you talk to the old folks, about going back in the valley and suddenly bumping into this really tall Hawaiian guy who, when you look at him carefully, you realize he's got very, very stiff hair down the back of his neck. And if he turns his head the right way, all of a sudden his eyes glow red. And that's not a guy. that's Kamapua'u. For some reason, you know, that particular afternoon is taking human form and cruising around his property as he legitimately can, because that's his. So in that situation, everyone who lives there is there by virtue of the acceptance of the ancestor who made the property. You don't stay in the house unless the person that owned the house says you can stay there. So in that situation, Kobe's going to have no interest in going there. He's not part of that group. He's never been invited there. And he doesn't want to piss off that tall thing, who obviously has all sorts of abilities. And sorry, I'm sure you're really spiffy, but you don't have that same stuff. Okay. Now, the other part of that then is if something goes wrong, who are you going to try to get help from? Who's the most powerful thing you know in this system? I mean, in that system.
Your clan ancestor.
Yeah, exactly, your ancestor. So in many ways, what is the idea of family is also in many ways the idea of religion. In a traditional Pacific Island system, you cannot sort family from religion. They're parts and parcel of the same linked system. A large part of your religion, which is based in place, is based in family, is based in the ancestor, which is also the thing you're going to ask for help from. One, because it should listen to you because you're family. So it should be most likely to pay attention to you. And secondly, if you're where you're supposed to be doing what you're supposed to do, it's that group's, it's that ancestor's obligation to do something about it. Hang on a second. See what Chet's got to say here. Come on, babes. Oh, here we go. Someone's asking, did borders of Ahupua's cross boundaries with different family gods from other? In some cases. In many cases, it appears that Ahupua's were in part defined by particular ancestors. But we're not sure what the relationship is there. And again, this goes back to what I was saying, I think I mentioned at the start. We don't really have a good grasp of the family Aku, or the family gods. We do with, like Charlot did, we do with Kamapua'a. The literature in many cases is there in the Hawaiian newspapers. Just no one's ever bothered to collate it, and for most of us, translate it, though I can read Hawaiian. So, you know, it's probably out there. My guess would be that in part, the answer would be yes. In part, given the fact that Ahupua's were actually resource-based, it might not be the case. And it would depend on where you are. If you've got a fair amount of resources, I would say yes. Ahupua'a probably also reflected the idea that a particular ancestor built a piece of property that was then self-sustaining. So the key here is when you're talking about the identity of people and land then, it's a really, really big thing, because people and land was also tied to your genealogy, it was tied to your family, and it was tied to essentially your religion. You couldn't separate religion from place. Now, it's not the same discussion you see today in terms of religions in place, but it was very much how things were. Now, the other thing you have to remember, this is probably, for some reason, I don't know, this seems to be the hardest thing for people to wrap around. Again, I grew up in a clan system, so to me it makes perfect sense, but for a lot of folks it might be a little difficult. We'll say that, I'm going to pick on Julian since he's already an easy one. He's the pig god. When that particular thing, when Kamapua'a makes folks, because he's bored or he's lonely or whatever, so he makes his children, i.e. the family, the descendants of Kamapua'a, as would usually be called today, he's actually going to make something else. What other thing is he going to make when he's making people? See if you guys can figure this out. So he's going to make
Animals.
People. Which animal? You're right. He's going to make a particular species of animal. Think about it for a sec. What's he called? The pig god. So what's the other thing he makes because he's lonely? Pigs. Now, again, I grew up in this system. In the clan that I'm a part of, we see snakes as being our elder relatives. So snakes and lizards are not animals. Snakes and lizards are my uncles and my aunties, more so than my aunties and uncles who are people. So in the system I grew up in, I don't see a distinction between things running around on four legs that you guys call reptiles and people. Having said that, the whole package of things that I would call people, in fact, this is the way the word is used in Arapaho State, is the folks that are part of my clan. So my clan doesn't consist just of people walking around in 2 feet. My clan also consists of a bunch of things running around in 4 feet, or in some cases with no feet. Okay. But all those things together are the clan. Now, if you're Kihawahine's children in Kaneohe, then that clan would consist of, on one hand, the people that she made, but it would also consist of the lizards that would be the other thing that she made. The combination of the two of those would be the clan. It wouldn't just be people. It'd also be a group of 4-legged things that are going around snacking on insects. They're all seen as people. Now, among other things, this means you can talk to them. So in my clan, we interact with lizards fairly frequently, and they'll talk to you or they'll do things with you. Okay. If most famous of these, it'd probably be there's still a few folks that do this. If you go to Kanakakai on the south side of Molokai, the ancestor there for at least 3 of the families is Pele's brother, who was the shark god who lived in the cave underneath where the pier is now. Well, the cave's still there. And traditionally, till fairly recently, and they might still do this, I don't know, I haven't been over there in ages, you'll find that some of the members of the family will, when they go throw net, they'll actually throw chum in the water to bring the sharks in. And the kids will go out and play with sharks. I mean, I used to do this when I was a kid. You go out and you grab sand sharks and stuff, and you go out and you grab them by the fin, they tow you around. It's like having a little motorboat. It's really good fun. And you'll find these kids playing with, like 2, 3, 4 foot, tiger sharks and black-tip sharks. And at the time, if you're not familiar with it, you're probably like all freaking out thinking like, dude, you're going to be missing a hand pretty soon. And they think nothing of it. If you watch them throw nets, you'll see that very frequently the sharks will appear to drive fish into the net. And then when you catch the fish, the first thing you do is you take some of the fish and you go and you hand feed the sharks. Now, those particular folks are all descended from the shark god. For those folks that are doing the fishing, who do they consider their older relatives?
All the sharks.
All the sharks. And this is why those folks got so incredibly pissed off back in the 80s and 90s when people were getting snacked on over on Maui, especially surfing off of Olowalu. The state came up with this whole idea of going and sending people out to hunt sharks to get rid of the bad sharks. And folks on Molokai were taking shots at them. And everyone, all pressing was like, oh, what's wrong with you guys? These guys are trying to save people from sharks. It's like, well, that's a stupid idea anyways. But even more importantly, they totally didn't understand that if I'm one of those families on Molokai and I see some fisherman coming into Maui and he pulls into the Kanakakai Pier and he's got 2 sharks in the back of the boat. And we'll say he's going to cut them up and take the fins because he's going to sell the fins. What did you just do to me? As far as I'm concerned, what did you just do?
Just killed some family.
He killed family. He killed my auntie or my uncles. And on top of that, he's butchering them. He's going to sell their pieces. As far as I'm concerned, it's cannibalism. And I'm not going to be a happy camper. And if I get in his face and said, oh, you shouldn't do this because da-da-da-da-da, in the modern American context, and he's going to be from lineage, he's going to be thinking, dude, you're weird. How can that be related to you? It's a fish. Okay. So when you're in clan systems, you have to remember that clans don't consist just of people. Clans consist of 2 packages. There's the people half of the equation, and there's the non-people half of the equation. The section of East Maui that I work in, one of the groups there is Mole, so it's lizard clan, so it's in some strange way probably related to what I'm familiar with back on the reservation. The other group is Pueo, the owl. And those 2, even though they're different ancestors, those 2 groups are seen as sort of like buddies. It's like they went to, I don't know, they went to Roosevelt together or something like that. Who knows what it is, but for some reason those ancestors get along. So their descendants all get along. So in that part of Maui, if you're part of the owl clan or part of the owl families, it's okay to marry in with the snake lizard families because the mole families are seen as sort of simpatico or similar. They're sort of like us in terms of the owl families. And, and if you're part of that whole system, if I go back there and I'm up there working up in Kanaio, for example, almost invariably I end up with large pueos sitting on my car. They don't get near people. Owls hate people, but if you're part of that group, they're there. And then when they're there, you talk to them because they're relatives. But to outsiders, that seems like something that is either you're missing a few cards in the deck, or, and this gets into reverse ethnocentrism, if you're part of the sort of what used to be called New Age groups in a lot of upcountry Maui, for example, what happens if Makela is seen talking to an owl, and they'll say he looks really Hawaiian and he's acting really Hawaiian? What are all the folks in Maui going to think if they see him talking to that owl? What stereotype are they going to use? Again, goes back, remember what the European stereotypes of Hawaiians are. If they're innocent people and they're children of nature and stuff like that, why does it make perfect sense he talks to owls? I'll give you a hint. They know nothing about his relationship with owls. They're not interested in clams. They're looking at this from a classic Northern California, Sausalito perspective, like Moana. Are they going to think that they could talk to owls? It's going to fulfill their stereotype.
They probably just think the Hawaiians would talk to animals.
Yeah. You guys are simpatico with animals. Now they're going to think you can also talk to sharks or anything else. And I can tell you, if it was a fact, the folks in that part of East Maui do not get along with sharks. In that part of East Maui, sharks are considered really bad news. And if you see a shark, none of the family down there would ever go diving out there, because sharks like to eat pigs, sharks like to eat lizards, and sharks like to eat owls. Now, I don't know how they know that, and I don't know how I know that, but I know it's true. Okay. So those families there do not like shark families, and they don't like sharks. So you're not going to find a lot of folks from southern part of Kaunakakai hanging out in that part of Maui. Vis-a-vis, you're not going to find a lot of folks on that part of Maui messing around in Kaunakakai. So there's not, in the Polynesian concept, you don't talk to animals, because ironically, if Makela is part of that group and he's talking to that owl, he's not talking to an animal. He's talking to a relative that just happens to have feathers and has the ability to fly, but he does not see it as an animal. And I think in the modern American context, this is really, really hard for people to wrap their heads around, because it's totally outside of sort of the, concept of reality that Anglo-Americans have. Now, it's not true necessarily a lot of the minority groups in, for example, the United States, but in larger sort of mainstream Anglo-American society, it's not legit. So when you're looking at clan is on one hand a group of people. It's also a group of things. It goes through time. The original founding member is still around. It is a large part of that's your religious system. And it's responsible for pretty much how you see the world. And it also legitimizes your place in the world. So this is the system that the Polynesians bring up here. So in the traditional Polynesian system, when you're talking about ainga, when we're going to use the Samoan term since it's the most common and it's just good to remember it, the traditional ainga prior to Christianization of Samoa would have been one of these clans. Now, ironically, those Samoa in most cases have become very Christianized. They've very aggressively jumped into this late 19th century. You can still see this if you look at the tatau that you put on your body in Samoa. The tatau that you put on your body in Samoa is invariably going to be the tatau of the ainga, which is also the tatau of the clan ancestor. So ironically, folks still they're aggressively Christian and they go to church religiously. That's not a pun. But ironically, the markings on the body are part of an older system. Now, if you're in a real conservative part like East Maui, which is pretty seriously conservative, what problem would people have if I suddenly go back to that part of Maui and I've gotten some really nice tribal tattoos done down in Kapahulu? I've got some really nice shark tattoos done on my legs, and it looks really nice. I picked it out of a catalog down in Kapahulu. What's going to happen when I go back to East Maui? One of my aunties.
Trader.
Go ahead.
Trader.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like, dude, what the hell? So on the other hand, if I'm putting tatau that are related to the scales of the snake, for example, the moa tatau, or to a certain extent, if I were to put feathers from the pueo on my back, those would actually be okay because you're actually part of that. Now, the interesting thing is my relatives might actually not diss on me per se. They'll just stay away from me. Who are they really expecting to give me a hard time? Or let's say more actually, what are they expecting will give me a really hard time if I go back to Maui? I'll give you a hint. She's about 6.5 feet tall, She looks really Hawaiian, and she's got really funny skin. Who does that part of Maui belong to? The ancestor. So my aunties and my uncles aren't going to think they have to get on my case. They're just going to wait for the ancestor to just drop a load on me. Because the ancestor's still around, the ancestor's going to be really pissed off. Okay. So this was the system that people had. This was the traditional Polynesian system. Now, in parts of Polynesia, it still exists. In parts of Polynesia, especially where the Adioi comes in, which is antithetical to the clan religion, it gets partially replaced. Now, here in Hawaii, when the Adioi comes in, when the new religion comes in part, it gets replaced. But what happens is a lot of it sort of goes underground, in the same way that when the Irish became Catholic, there's still a lot of the old Celtic belief system buried underneath the Catholicism. We just make sure the priest doesn't see it. In the same way here, when the new religion becomes embraced by especially the guys in charge, the common population in many cases still holds to the idea of the power of ancestors. They just make sure they don't do it somewhere where they're going to get caught. Okay? And so this makes one of the complexities you see when you look at Hawaiian religion. There isn't one Hawaiian religion. There's two Hawaiian religions. There's the later religion, and there's the old one. And the old one is the clan and the clan system. Now in Samoan, the two parts of this, and again, this was the political structure too. Not surprisingly, if the things that you see as being real are the things like you're not going to have a lot of trust for things that are different. So each Ainga was pretty much a standalone proposition, each extended family, each clan. They would have a person in charge who basically interacted with outsiders. That would be the Matai. And the various clans that were tied to each other, either by virtue of location, maybe in related Ahupua or whatever, would set up a council of related clans, usually where these guys would hang out and talk story, try to figure out and resolve problems, etc. And that's the fono. So that was the extent of your political system. This is still what you see till very, very recently in Samoa, Tonga, etc. It's the old system. Okay. And if you look at the European accounts, for example, in Tahiti, you find that this was still what existed in Tahiti, was this system. It gets overlain by this new religion and change. Okay. So the other part of this then is land was owned by the ancestor. Now, land wasn't owned by people. People did not own property. To a certain extent, you could argue the Ainga or the family owned property. But in reality, since the ancestor was still alive, it was ancestor's land. So human beings didn't own property, nor did lizards or pigs or whatever own property. The group did, but more accurately, the ancestor, who was the head of the family, owned everything. So there was no concept of ownership. And that meant to a large extent, you couldn't tell another family what to do with their property, because guess what? Why should they listen to you? Now, one of the third effects, of course, is that with the religion then, the vast majority of your religion is going to be you PRing that ancestor, so that ancestor will help you. Yeah, okay, let's see. The other term we ought to do now, since we got the time, is the concept of mana. Mana is actually, I think in some ways, a harder concept to sort of get across in its traditional form, in the fact that mana is so heavily used today, and sort of abused, I'd argue, in many ways. The traditional concept, again, is tied to this idea of clan, but it's also tied to another principle, and the principle is basically a form of, I don't know, biology or physics, I don't know what you want to call it. Most societies have a very strong sense that there's a form of energy that's related to the idea of life. So things that are alive are different than things that are inert. And that difference is defined as that particular form of energy. So mana is a concept found in almost all societies. In the Asian system, it's called chi, but it's the same thing. Some sort of energy that relates to the concept of being alive, of life, of existence in that form. Ironically, in anthropology, what happens is in the 19th century, when anthropologists are first looking at religion, they realize it's sort of universal, and they're trying to figure out a word for it, because there isn't really a word that there's Celtic words for it, but there wasn't a word that they felt was interesting. So for some reason, they looked at the Hawaiian literature, and they thought, hey, this Hawaiian word's a really good word that we're going to use. So mana is on one hand a Hawaiian word for this life energy, But mana is also a word used technically in anthropology for pretty much exactly the same thing. Now, I don't know why they didn't use chi instead. It would have been easier if they had. But it makes life sort of complicated from here. But the key thing for our purposes is mana in the Hawaiian traditional concept. And again, this is true in all the Pacific, not just in Polynesia. Mana is the concept that life is a form of energy. Now, it's important to remember when you look at the traditional concepts of mana, it was not seen as something exotic and mysterious. It wasn't something to do like a crystal or a Ouija board or something like that. It was just another form of energy. And the analogy I always use is it's just like electricity. Electricity exists. You have generators that generate electricity. You have wires that transmit electricity, and you have light bulbs like the like the ones running this, or the energy running the computer that are using electricity. And no one gets particularly excited about it. If you call up Spectrum or Hawaiian Electric or something like that to fix something, you don't sit there and burn incense to them and give them blessing. Well, you might if you want to lower the rates, but those guys are not magicians. They're just electricians. So electricity is seen as something you can take courses, you can become an electrical engineer. It's seen as something that's measurable, it's very practical, it's very pragmatic, and it's very real. For everyone out of Anglo-American society, mana is equally pragmatic, practical, and real. It's not seen as something mysterious, something exotic, and something you sort of have to get into the zone to get. It's just a form of energy, and like electricity, it can be generated, it can be transmitted, it can be stored, and it can be used. So the key thing to remember is when you're looking at traditional concepts of mana, is mana was not something mysterious or spiritual or something like that. It was just a form of energy. The way you acquired and transmitted it was different than electricity, pretty obviously, but nonetheless, it was seen equally pragmatically. And you still see this, you do traditional fishing, with example, you go fishing with my relatives, for example, on Maui, and you leave an offering at the little place where we go to leave an offering before you go diving for taco or whatever that we're going for that day. And you leave that for the ancestor at that particular location, also for the particular spirit that's in charge of taco or octopus, because that's where they hang out. You don't send along prayer. You don't think of something mysterious. It's like paying a toll on a toll road. When you come back, you leave the first of whatever you caught there as a thank you for having done that. But again, you don't see it as religion per se. And you sort of see it as religion, but you don't see it as anything really exotic, no more than I do when I come in the office and flip the light switch and the lights go on. It's just part of the way the world works, and it's a form of energy. And in that situation, the fact that we're able to find that particular thing and catch those things and eventually eat those things was due to the fact that we had life energy, which gave us the life energy, one, to chase them, and gave us the ability to basically catch them. So in the same way that electricity allows your phone to work, and without it, nothing happens, it's just a dead device. Mana basically makes or has the potential for changing things, but most importantly, it is life energy. In the traditional Hawaiian concept, as in the rest of Polynesia, mana was seen in a very practical way. And mana was largely given to folks by the ancestors. So one of the reasons you PR Kamapuaa, for example, if you're a kid, one of his kids, is he's the main thing that doles out mana. So if you would, he's the equivalent of the Heko generator at Kahe Point. Okay. So you want to keep the bugger happy because he's going to give you life energy. Now the life energy does two things. One is it keeps you alive, which is sort of important. Okay. If the ancestor, whoever pulls that life energy away, you're dead. You have no life energy, you're now inert. Okay. The other thing, and this is probably the other key thing to remember about mana, is mana doesn't make things happen. So it's not like the way they use it now with, for example, sporting events. What mana does is mana changes the potential that something will happen. It changes the percentages. So for example, if Malia is walking down the road, she's walking down, say, campus here, she's walking underneath one of the palm trees. And she's walking down there and a palm frond snaps off. If the palm frond falls in front of her or behind her, in the traditional sense, that would be because she has a fair amount of mana. Because she's walking down the steps, the palm snaps down here. The time it takes for that palm frond to land could land in front of her, it could have landed behind her, or it could land on top of her. the fact the palm frond snaps is not subject to mana. The fact that she's walking down the steps isn't subject to mana. The fact that she happens to be at that particular point, at that particular place, at that point in time is subject to mana. So if she's got basically almost no mana, what might happen when she walks down the steps? She'll get hit by the palm frond. Now, the whole event didn't happen because of mana, but the result that she gets bonked by it or it misses her would be a result of it. So this is the other reason that mana was so important in a traditional situation. If you had mana and you go fishing, you're more liable to catch fish. It's not like you're going to stand there and hold a bag and fish are going to jump into it. And if you're a lousy fisherman, you're still not going to catch crap. But if you're a good fisherman, you have a better chance of catching fish because your percentages, your luck, I suppose maybe in the American context is better. Now, probably the most spectacular example would be when Kamapua'a lands on Oahu. He lands in Waititi, around Diamond Head, both sides. First thing he does, he takes some Maui chiefs that he'd captured earlier, that he has stashed on the boat. He takes them up to the huge heiau at Papa'aina'ina, where La Pietra is. So he takes them to the huge heiau there and sacrifices them there. During the ceremony, he makes it very clear that he has now got the blessing of the gods of that part of the island of Oahu, who have now given him and his army mana. Now, because he's using the religious site that's on that part of Oahu to do that, if you're one of the Oahu warriors that are standing up in Nu'uanu watching that, what's your sense of the Kamehameha Army's mana versus your mana now after that ceremony? Who's got it? Remember, it's your heiau, it's your religious site. Who's got it and who don't after the ceremony? Kamehameha's side's got it. He did the right ceremony, he did the right things, he gave his army mana. As we'll see, this is actually part of the later system, but the mana thing holds true. The Oahu warriors, on the other hand, weren't able to do the ceremony because they didn't have the heiau. They didn't have the religious site. So therefore, even as far as they were concerned, not only does this amp up the Cam guys because they're thinking, dude, we got it, we're going to kick some ass. But the Oahu warriors are also at that point, some of them start doing their death chants. Why? Because they too are convinced that these warriors from the Big Island of Maui now have more mana than they do. Now, that's not going to make them invulnerable. But what it means is if the guy from the Big Island throws a spear or fires a gun, he has a better percentage chance of hitting one of the Oahu guys. Conversely, if one of the Oahu guys fires a gun or throws a spear, he has less chance of hitting the Big Island guys. So to a certain extent, in a very clever sense, you have to remember, Kamehameha was a superb politician. He played this out because what he did is just lowered the morale of the Oahu guys. He basically convinced them, you're going to lose. Because now they might be better technical warriors, but now when chance comes into play, they're not going to have luck or chance on their side, and the Big Island guys are always going to have luck and chance on their side. It was a superb, clever military political move done by a guy who was a superb politician. You know, and that's one reason why the Big Island guys kicked ass. They didn't really outnumber the Oahu guys that much, but if you got one army that's pretty convinced they're not going to win, they just want to go down looking good, and the other guys are convinced they're going to kick ass, it's not surprising what the end result's going to look like. So that's mana. Mana did not make things happen. Mana changes the potential for particular results from things. That form of mana still exists in a lot of ways, but the problem you get into in the 19th and 20th century is mana now has been sort of converted to like a magic, where if someone has a lot of mana, things happen to them. Doesn't work that way. That's not the way it was. But the key for our purposes is this is largely given to you by the ancestor. So this makes the ancestor even more important. The ancestor, it's not only the ancestors' land you live on, it's the ancestors who are in their folks who are your relatives, but they're also the ones that dole out life energy that keeps you alive and makes things happen. So that's the clan religion. In all this package, not surprisingly then, your economy is based on this idea of this extended family, the Ainga. Your land, your property, what you do. In fact, this idea of localized self-sufficiency, which I think Julian was asking about, then you can start to see how that ties into the Ahupua'a. Families aren't going to be particularly interested or particularly comfortable trading and interacting heavily with folks who are part of a different clan whose clan is not somehow got a warm and fuzzy with you guys. So you're going to keep your distance. So you're not going to have a lot of relationships. Now in this, if you're going to beat up on folks, if you're Kamapua's clan, for example, and you're in Kahana, and you can think about this in a weird way. I think you almost see a little bit of this with contemporary high school sports here in the islands, which doesn't come from Hawaiian context, but you see a little bit of this. If you're St. Louis, since of course they're not only our school here, but they're also one of the big power brokers. What's more important, to beat Waianae or to beat some school from Boise, Idaho? Oh, come on, that should be an easy one, folks.
The local one.
Yeah. What's the advantage of beating the local school?
You can gloat.
Yeah, it's bragging rights. Everyone knows how good Waianae is, so they know it's going to be a good game. So if you beat them, that means something. What do people here know about Boise, Idaho? Shit, they don't even know where it is. They know what that high school is. They're probably not even particularly sure where the hell Idaho is, except maybe they think they grow potatoes. So, you know, they might be a good school, but it doesn't mean anything. And to a certain extent, if you're St. Louis, you know, you'd be really ambivalent about having your team play them because some of the guys get injured. And the next game is going to be against, I don't know, Castle or something like that. Then that's, you know, or even worse, Punahou. You know, last thing you want to have is guys injured and can't play the Punahou game, so you lose to Punahou. No one gives a rat's ass if you lose to Boise. You know, it's irrelevant. So in that situation, competition is measured by the competition that you know, not a competition of strangers. And this is why when UH plays, you know, Division II teams from God knows someplace in Florida, you know, that might make them look like a win-loss column, and no one gives a rat's ass, and no one ever shows up to the stadium. Why? Because who cares? It's not a legitimate match. It's like, it's in a vacuum. So to a certain extent, in traditional Hawaiian society, competition was always measured by the folks around who were part of different clans you did not have a warm and fuzzy with. But you knew that they were good, so kicking their ass meant something. Because everyone knew who the players were, everyone knew how powerful the players were. And remember, the players include the ancestors. So in a traditional Hawaiian system, you're part of Kamapua's group and you decide to go sailing down from Kahana and look for some trouble, I don't know, down at Waimanalo or something like that. In that situation, you're looking for trouble from a group you know about. So beating them will show that you have more mana than they do. If you go sail and go beat some group from Samoa, who knows what the hell mana they've got? So you can't brag about it. So there's no point in spending the time and effort on it. So what you get is warfare in traditional early Hawaiian society was for prestige. So when you're done beating the crap out of the guys Waimanalo, you go back to Kahana, pop a few Bud Lights and go like this, you know, have the pee-pee call and a good old time and go brag, you know, we kicked their ass and da-da-da-da-da. You know, it's going to go, yeah, that looks so good, da-da-da-da-da. Okay, and that's why you did it. You don't get anything out of it. You don't end up with property in Waimanalo. You don't bring a bunch of food back. You just go down there to kick some ass and show that you're better than they are. Now, if they get their shit together, they're going to come back and then try to kick your ass. Why? Because you did it to them and they want to show they got their one up on you. So it's all measuring mana in performance. In this case, performance and violence. Now, one of the classic ways you can see this, what else we got here I haven't picked on yet? If Destiny decides in a traditional, in fact, you see this because Cook sees this when he goes to Tahiti. If Destiny's part of one of these groups, and so she's doing this down in Tahiti, same system. When she goes somewhere, she's going to be in a bunch of canoes. So a bunch of these canoes are going down the coast. What she's going to do is she's going to stand in the front of the biggest canoe, since she's in charge of the group, and she's going to chant her genealogy, and she's going to emphasize her ancestor before she lands there, because she wants to pick a fight with these guys. She wants to make it very clear, this is who I am, this is who we are, and we're going to come kick your ass. Okay. Now, the group that she's going to, what are they going to do on this? They're staying on the seashore there. Who's their boss guy going to, what's he going to do? You still see this if you watch rugby. If you watch the All Blacks do rugby, anyone knew what they do before they start a match?
They do the haka.
They do the haka. Why are they doing the haka?
That's their war chant.
Okay, and what is it supposed to give them?
It's supposed to like receive mana and
Yeah.
put fear in the opposite team.
Exactly. And notice how if you're getting mana, you're also saying to the other guys, I got it, you don't. So if they're going to go play Fiji, who they hate, the Fijians can't stand them either. What are the Fijians going to do?
Their version of the Haka.
Yeah, exactly. Which is actually pretty lame. They never came up with a particularly good one yet, which is something I got to think about. You know, so I mean, to a certain extent,
All
what
knocks
you've
on
got,
top.
yeah. So that's what happens. That's what Destiny's going to do when she goes ashore on some island there. She stands in the front. She does her version of what would be called a haka, which is basically a genealogy chant bragging about mana. The guy who's in charge on shore is going to do his version of it and basically say, oh, no, we got more than you, and here it is, da-da-da-da. So genealogy, warfare, religion, family, all packaged in together. It was a tight, needy, tidy package. That's the system that we had here till the 1500s. Okay, so that's the huge mystery is these, because you have to remember this was true in all of Polynesia. So for some reason, and again, it's this huge mystery, you've got some guys hanging around Tahiti. They've got this system. They've had it for 1,000, 2,000 years, whatever. Everyone's comfortable with it. It works. Everyone's got it. It makes perfect sense. The whole system's tied in together. It's a nice, tidy, seamless package. It's all your own design. And all of a sudden, some guy comes from an island to the east and says, oh, you guys are full of shit. This is totally not right. This is not the way it's supposed to be done. Here, I'm going to tell you the way it's supposed to be done, and this is what it is. And you got to dump all this old crap because that's bullshit. Now, the first thing you got to think is if you're a bunch of people standing on the shore watching this guy, you'd be thinking, dude, did you get dropped in your head when you were a baby or what? Why the hell would you listen to someone who tells you that basically everything you believe in is crap? And you've got to do this new way of doing stuff. That's the huge mystery that no one has solved. Someone's eventually going to have to go back in time, I think, and go try to figure out what the hell there was in this Adioi religion that would let people give up the relationship to family, the relationship to land, the relationship to mana, the relationship to religion, the relationship to everything gets tanked by this new religion because they say it's all wrong, and here we're going to give you what it's supposed to really be. And the new really be is totally different than the old what it was. Okay? So the Adioi is a fascinating mystery because it has nothing to do with the outside. This is all by Polynesians, for Polynesians, in Polynesia. And it's not just one little group, it then spreads over a lot of the rest of the area. Like I said, we know a lot about the end of it because the Europeans get dragged into it, especially on Tahiti. So we do know it, and of course it becomes the manifestation. We see that here. This becomes the high chiefly system that Cook dies in. The guys that he's dealing with, Kalaniʻōpuʻu and the rest of these boys, they are the result of the Adioi religion. They're not the result of the old system. Okay? So when you look at Hawaiian society at the time of European recording, it's of the Adioi version of the society. The old system's still there, but it's not of the chiefs. The old system is still found. In fact, you still find it today. In fact, in some ways, it's been more durable. You go to East Maui, you go to Niihau, places like that, people still have ancestors. They still have family. They still have a large part of the system. But they basically had to sort of do it underground, as it were, to a certain extent, because this new system comes in as an overlay and basically says this is the way it works. Okay. So what we'll get into next time is what does this new system look like? How did it change things? Because this is when people talk about classical Hawaiian society in contrast to the post-contact period. It's the Adioi version of the system that people think of as classical, not necessarily the older system. Okay, so I think we'll stop there. It's a tidy spot. Okay, the old system defined by clans. Yes, well, yeah, let me I'll get a little ahead of myself. You have to remember that when, in fact, you see it here on the chart, the system that the Adioi bring into, and this is the same in Tahiti as it is here, it's a system which isn't clan-based. The Adioi argue, or here it would be called Pa'ao argue, that the way that their god Oro said the world should be is a world that consists of three types of people. At the top is one species. This is the Ari'i, or you guys might call them the Li'i, same diff. In Tahiti, it'd be Ariki. Okay. They are a different species than the commoners, which are called Manahune in Tahiti, and are called Makainana here. And there's a third group which is without mana and the ability to hold mana, which would be Kauva or Ka'ad, depending on which pronunciation usually. Those become the new three groups. Now, if you notice, the distinction is between chiefs and commoners. It's not one clan to another clan. So at this point, no one's interested if Kobe's relationship was with Pele and Julian's relationship was with Kamapua'a. Now the only thing you want to know is, are you a chief or are you a commoner? So the game changes entirely. The Adiaway religion, one of its main agendas was to completely delegitimize and get rid of the idea of clan. It replaces clan ancestors with a new system of high gods, the Akua. So if you're Kamehameha, you claim descent from the god Tu, and you become a Tu priest. That's what Kamehameha was. He was the high priest for his section of the Big Island for the god Tu. There is no god Tu in the traditional system. That's not an ancestor. That's one of the four great gods. That's part of the Adiaway package. So yeah, what happens is the new system separates one group of people. Actually, it becomes a caste system, just like India. One caste is the chiefs, another caste is the commoners, and a third caste would be almost sort of the equivalent, not really untouchables, but sort of those of no mana. And in that, you intentionally and pull apart the whole idea of clan. So yeah, I mean, we'll get into it more next time, but yeah, you're exactly right. That's exactly what happens. And that's what the Europeans see, is at least on the surface. Of course, since the chiefs are all part of this new package, that's the system they think is traditional Hawaiian society, because that's what they see in 1770. Okay. Does that all sort of make sense? Though we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. Okay, Jared's at least saying thumbs up. Okay, good. Okay, with that, why don't we stop, since that's enough to keep you guys out of trouble for a while. Let's see, let me close this. Any questions or concerns or other stuff? And you have to remember, all this is my interpretation. Don't take it as truth. If I had truth, I'd be making a lot more money. I wouldn't be teaching a shaman. So, it's just my spin on everything. But there's evidence to back it. There's different ways of looking at it. Lili Kala, for example, and I don't probably agree on much anything about that, but that's cool. Okay, any other questions or concerns? We all good?
All good.
Shoots. Okay, in that case, enough for Thursday. And I'll see you guys, I guess, next week, huh?
All right, see you next week, Professor.
Okay, I think, isn't Monday a holiday?
Yeah.
Shoots, okay. So have a good 3-day and take care.
Yeah. Take it easy.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.